It seems to me that, among the somewhat to very educated segment of the population, there is a commonly received belief that goes something like this. The universe is a big, shapeless, buzzing flux of particles. Whatever the current bestiary of subatomic physics is, that's what, quote-unquote, really exists. Whatever the ABCs of physics are, that's what reality really is. It can be subatomic particles, or atoms, or strings if you're a string theorist, or whatever. The specific entity isn't that important. We just assume that the base level of reality is whatever entities physics recognizes as fundamental. If the physicists add another elementary particle tomorrow, we'll recognize that one too. This is a very neat and theoretically parsimonious picture. What's real is just whatever physics says is real. There's just one problem. It seems to completely ignore the world we actually live in. If all that's real are fundamental particles, how come I can see dogs and tennis rackets and stuff like that? This might seem kind of weird and counterintuitive. Why would anyone think that the world is just a buzzing mass of particles? Why would we think that? Let me tell you a little story. It's going to be fictional. This is not where materialism really came from. But take it as mythopoiesis. This account is typological, not historical. I'm describing a dialectical process that occurs repeatedly, not something that actually happened once. Just let it wash over you. Once upon a time, some people were talking to each other. They noticed that people disagreed on lots of things. Some people believed in things like gods and souls and angels, and some people didn't. Some people thought that numbers were real things that had always existed, and some people thought that numbers were just things we made up. All kinds of stuff. Well, one of the people in this discussion stood up and said something like this. All right, look. We can have this discussion all day about how I'm not here, you're not here, whatever. But what's real to me is just what I can see and touch, okay? So my hands are real and this table is real. Stuff that is made of matter is real, and I haven't got time for gods or ghosts or numbers or monads or universals. The person who said this was very hard-headed and practical, and their statement appealed to hard-headed, practical people. It seemed very pragmatic and no-nonsense to reject anything spooky, like spirits and numbers, and just take it all down to matter. The hard-headed pragmatists decided to call this way of thinking materialism. However, the hard-headed practical people who believed in materialism also had a theoretical bent. See, they were all about pragmatism and getting things done, but they thought that the best way to get stuff done was to use your head and think things through. And as they thought things through, they asked themselves, what is matter made of? Eventually, they decided that matter was made of teeny tiny little bits called atoms. So all that really existed were atoms and the space in which the atoms moved. We made up things like sweetness and bitterness and truth and justice by convention. But in reality, it was just atoms in the void. This was all very cool and Occam's razory, but eventually the materialists ran into a problem. If atoms are the only thing that really exists, then how come we see a world full of different objects? Squirrels exist, or at least they seem to. How can that be if squirrels aren't atoms? The materialists decided they would come up with a knockdown explanation for this, and they've been trying to do that ever since. They invented lots of fancy theoretical terms like emergence and supervenience, and they came up with all kinds of intricate concepts to explain how things emerge from the dance of atoms. But it never quite worked. The problem was that no matter what mechanism they posited to explain how things emerge, some smart aleck could always ask how the mechanism itself emerged, and that put the materialists back at square one. For example, one of the materialists said, by convention sweet, and by convention bitter, by convention hot, by convention cold, by convention color, but in reality, atoms and void. That was Democritus. So that should answer the question, right? But then some smart aleck can come up and ask, then where does convention come from? And Democritus realizes that all he did was kick the can down the road. A more modern materialist might say something like this: there are no real patterns. There is no real order in this universe. The only patterns or order that exist are subjective projections of human beings. And then a more modern smart aleck can ask, and where do brains get this magical ability to project order onto things? The modern materialist, if they're smart, will realize that they, too, just kicked the can down the road. Think of it like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat. The rabbit is lived experience, and the hat is the dance of atoms. But any magic trick you use to get the rabbit also has to come out of the hat. And if you try to get that trick out of the hat, then you need a second trick to get the first trick, but the second trick also has to come out of the hat. The latest response to this kind of counter began in the 20th century, and it goes something like this. Oh, whatever. Who cares how we get the rabbit out of the hat? Who cares what really exists? Modern science is really cool, and it makes lasers and rocket ships and stuff. So let's just ignore the question of how the rabbit got in the hat. This is consistent with the pragmatic nature of the people who like to call themselves materialists. You might protest and say, now wait a minute, that doesn't scratch the itch that gave rise to the questions about the nature of reality in the first place. And you'd be quite right to say that. You might also ask a snide question about why pragmatists bother doing philosophy at all if they're not interested in the questions about what really exists. If that's the case, then why don't they go become physicists or engineers? The more sophisticated materialists have an answer to that one too. The point of philosophy is therapy. See, lots of people come up with these funny questions about what really exists and what ultimate reality is and so on, but those are bad questions. The purpose of philosophy is to dissolve those questions and make it seem like they aren't necessary, or rather, show how they are not necessary. See, all these questions about what's really true and what things are really made of and what the ultimate nature of reality is, they're all just confusions that come from misunderstanding language. Language ties us up in knots, and it's the philosopher's job to untangle the knots so that we'll stop asking weird questions that are inconvenient for materialism. In case you want to see this in the wild, look at Stephen Stitch or the Churchlands. In all three cases, Stephen Stitch and the two Churchlands, we see die-hard scientific realists and materialists who slowly slide into pragmatism and scientific instrumentalism. This is an example of the dialectic I outlined above. It's a pipeline from hard-headed realist to some flavor of idealism, which is ironic given the motivations at play. If you have some background in philosophy, then you might stop here and shout, "Hey, that stuff about language and therapy sounds like Wittgenstein." And while this latest form of materialism is, in some sense, an adaptation of the late Wittgenstein, I think that Wittgenstein himself would have rejected it. The line of materialist thinking I've outlined still rests on an implicit reductionism. We might not want to answer the question of how convention arises from the dance of atoms, but we ultimately still say that natural science is the gold standard for human cognition, and everything else must, in some sense, be subordinated to it. Wittgenstein would have observed, rightfully I think, that line of thinking is still in thrall to the totalizing impulse it claims to reject. That last sentence was kind of cryptic, I should explain it. Here's what I mean. If you ask a pragmatist what really exists, the pragmatist will say, "I don't know what you mean by really, tell me what you're interested in specifically and I'll give you an answer." And if you press a sophisticated pragmatist on how convention arises from the dance of atoms, or how things like minds and sensation and so on can arise from buzzing atoms, they'll say it doesn't matter. That sort of question is wrong-headed. I don't talk about things like ultimate reality or what's really true. I only care about what's useful. However, while the pragmatist will never come right out and say it, most of them still believe that natural science is supreme. They still have this idea that the world as natural science sees it, a world of atoms, is a privileged lens that all other perspectives must pay obeisance to, even if they won't state that directly. But the so-called ontological itch that drives us to ask what is ultimate reality is also what motivates the privileging of natural science over all other perspectives. To wit, materialism is just one more stick in the bundle on the metaphysician's back. As soon as you release the compulsion to investigate the ultimate basis of things, you also release the desire to make natural science a cognitive gold standard. And that, in turn, opens the door to things like gods and ghosts. Wittgenstein, perhaps the most consistent and subtle of these thinkers, would simply shrug and say, sure, theologians can do theology and physicists can do physics. Who cares? It needn't all hang together. In the laboratory, believe in atoms. At the seance, believe in spirits. But almost nobody besides Wittgenstein would be comfortable saying such a thing. The conviction of materialists that one day reason and science will banish all metaphysical specters is ultimately based on an Enlightenment conceit that rationality can perfect mankind. And this, ironically, is rooted in a pre-modern, that is, theistic, notion of rationality. The following quotation is from the Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy, The Critique of Instrumental Reason. You'll see a link in the description. Critical theorists argue that in the ancient world, the concept of reason was an objective and normative one. Reason was thought to refer to a structure or order of what ought to be, which was inherent in reality itself, and which prescribed a certain way of life as objectively rational. Human beings were thought to have a subjective faculty, which allowed them to perceive and respond to this objective structure of the world. This faculty could then also be called reason in a derivative sense. Even when ancient philosophers spoke of reason as a human faculty rather than as a structure of the world, their conception of it was, so to speak, substantive. Humans were thought to be able to use reason to determine which goals or ends of human action were worthy of pursuit. In the post-Enlightenment world, the objective conception of reason becomes increasingly implausible. Reason comes to be conceived as essentially a subjective ability to find efficient means to arbitrarily given ends. That is, to whatever ends the agent in question happens to have. The very idea that there could be inherently rational ends is abandoned. Reason becomes subjective, formal, and instrumental. If I think that science must inevitably banish all superstition, then I am assuming that instrumental reason cannot be turned to any ends besides secularism. In other words, I am assuming not only that I inhabit a godless universe, but that there is an inherent metaphysical order to this universe which demands that rational beings eventually recognize its materialistic nature. Notions of progress, or a dialectical materialist's inevitability, historical inevitability, that is, are inevitably rooted, ironically, in a sense of metaphysical order, however much holders of such notions may expostulate. If a materialist wishes to remain coherent at all, he finds himself returning not to a Dawkinsian worldview, but to some manner of Spinozism, with its attendant notions of nature as God and eternal life. Of course, this all hinges on a willingness to remain coherent, and coherence is surprisingly easy to abandon, but that's a topic for another time.